שלום
Good
לכולם.
day to everyone. Since I am a journalist, unlike in the previous discussion, this discussion will be more of a journalistic nature. I would like to ask Adi Brender of the research department of Bank of Israel to present his study. Good evening to everyone. I would like to discuss in my presentation the framing of the question that was posed to the panel, and that is regarding the ratio between defense spending and civil spending and where to go from here. And I'd like to discuss the effort we've made in the budget to see how the multi-year defense budget that we had in the Brender guidelines and what we can learn from that for the civil budget. First of all, the question that was posed, the allocation of resources between the civil and the defense, is an important question. I think Shmuel, who spoke here earlier in the previous session, he described it very clearly. It's basically one subject out of many regarding how the budget is allocated, and it's not necessarily clear that that's the most important one. There is, of course, the question regarding more taxes and more services, and the increase of disposable income when there are lower taxes enabling people to do what they want with their money. That's one choice that has to be made when deciding on public policy. There is also the matter of allocations for liabilities. Are we paying for what we're spending, or are we going to leave it to our children in the form of a deficit? And there is the allocation not only between defense and civil expenses, there's also between health and education and other things. And there are also the subsidies for the needies as opposed to subsidies for the product. In the 1980s, there were some very important choices that the government made at that time. And what was also mentioned at length by Shmuel, and I think it's also a very important choice, if the government intervenes directly by using the budget, or does it intervene by means of regulation? If you think simplistically about the minimum wage is a salary grant on the one hand, and it is a tax on the employers, and the government can do it by means of the budget, and the government can say to the employers, you pay it, and it's not going to be part of the budget at all. And every choice of that kind has many implications regarding efficiency, regarding social goals and other values. And so all these things are choices, and we have to bear in mind that the context of the budget discussion is far more broad than between defense and civil budgets. And we were in a completely different place in the 1980s and early 1990s when the defense budget was about 20% of the product. At that time, indeed, every advancement in terms of the civil expense had to go through a series of completely different choices in terms of the tax burden and the ratio between the deficit and the debt, and at that time. And it's an entirely different world, and I think it's better to focus the discussion on the efficiency of public spending and that this is the political preference, and it is the policymakers who make these decisions. They have certain preferences between defense and civil spending, and this apparently reflects also the preferences of their electorates. And the question is how one balances between these different preferences and how to find the most efficient way to divide up the budget. What I would like to add here is the matter of multi-year planning via the example of the defense budget, which can create a different better alternatives and streamlining of the public spending in a way that will enable the government to get better services with a given sum of money. What were the principles that served for the building of the defense budget? There's nothing particularly new here. First of all, the budgetary constraints limit the ability to increase the defense budget endlessly, just like other budgets. But when sensitive subjects like defense and health are concerned, there's no point in building the budget from bottom up, because with defense budgets we'll always find ourselves facing painful decisions whether or not to accept something, and ultimately they're not so much on this. So we know the discussions on the health basket. If the health basket was not determined from above and it was determined that this is what we're going to spend on health, in the end there would always be people who really are suffering, as opposed to a budgetary spending which doesn't seem very high, and the pressure to just spend that little bit more. And the same thing happens with defense. There's always something that appears very intimidating, and ultimately it's just a few millions, and that subject can be solved too. And so with budgets of this kind, you have to create the envelope and then work from the priorities down. What's important to remember in this discussion, unlike arguments that come up in the first lecture we heard spoke about it, defense is a normal expense. The higher the standard of living, the more security we expect to get. Those who grew up in Jerusalem in the 1960s or in Kiryat Shmona in the 1980s, they know there was a certain level of threats that we learned to live with. It was reasonable at that time that children ran through the streets and snipers took shots at them from time to time. Today we would not tolerate that. And in the 1980s, there were Katyusha rockets on homes at Kiryat Shmona on a daily basis. And today, the state of Israel, with its standard of living, would no longer accept people living that way. And that means we have to assure a higher level of defense. And that is a feature of the rise in the standard of living, and that demands an increasingly greater outlay on defense. And when productivity goes up, wages go up too. And so even thinking mathematically, if you want to employ the same number of people in defense, their wages go up, and so the costs will go up in real terms too. At the same time, unlike most of the civil spending, when we think about it, defense is usually a public expense in terms that it is an overall comprehensive product. So we can think about it in that the level of defense is related to the total defense spending and not per capita. Schools, for example, health services are provided on the individual level and depend on the size of the population. Defense spending, we can think about something that goes up with the standard of living and the per capita product, and so it creates a gap in the increase. And when we think about the difference between civil spending and defense spending. What are the implications of these principles? And these are principles more or less that the Brender committee adopted. It means that the defense budget will grow if we go on this track, and this will improve its efficiency because the system can adapt according to these expenses, and the civil system knows what resources it spends on defense in terms of the tax burden. And I will talk a bit more about the civil side in a moment. A system such as this decreases the weight of the defense spending in the budget and in the product, and enables increasing the civil spending without increasing overall spending, and increases the stability of the budgetary spending based on any ceiling the government chooses, in the assumption there is such a target. That was more or less the system that was determined by the Brender guidelines, and there were two questions basically. One claimed that we don't need a guideline for the defense system, and the other that took a different perspective and said, why only the defense system? First of all, in terms of the ability to meet the targets of the guideline, the blue line represents the Brender guideline, and there were many arguments about how to define it. But there was a lot of a lot of people ultimately agreed that the calculations we did in the Bank of Israel more or less represented what the actors were referring to, one way or the other. And so when we look here at the data, we can see that if the blue line is the Brodet guidelines, the red line are the actual spending, during the same period. In the year 2009, there were expenses of 1.9 billion. 1.9 billion shekels that the Prime Minister authorized because of Operation Cast Lead, and to this day there are still arguments as to whether it was included in the guideline. But ultimately we see that there is the ability of the system to meet the targets of a guideline that was set in 2007 and stick to it quite closely. Sadly, every year there were a lot of arguments until they reached that conclusion, but they did ultimately reach the result according to this guideline. I'm not showing the figures from 2014 because the government abandoned the Brodet guidelines and it was decided to move to an alternative guideline since then, and since then it hasn't existed. The target that Brodet decided on was to gradually decrease the defense budget relative to the product. And what we see here are the figures up to 2013. We can see the decrease from 7.8% of the product in 2007 to around 6.5% of the product, 6.4 in 2013. And without precise calculations regarding the guideline, there is an agreement on this subject, but by way of illustration, more or less from the different things that we've heard in the media, this is the guideline we're going to see for the rest of the decade. In other words, now that they're going to have a multi-year guideline, it's going to continue to reduce or decrease the weight of defense spending in the product as a percentage of the product. And the fact that they are meeting the macro targets is good. The question is whether it delivers the other goods. So the first thing, once again, they're adopting a multi-year guideline, and what was missing to a certain extent in the Brodet guideline is a bottom-up analysis, and I think there's no other way to determine a defense budget other than using a macro framework that reflects what the economy feels it can afford. The question is what type of security are we getting for this amount, and what are the implications? And of course, it's not human to expect people who are responsible for a budget to give you the most objective picture. Everyone will say, this is the money that you have, give me the picture. We'll always present the difficulties. We're familiar with the concept, but when you present things, they will always present how difficult and problematic things are. So it's important that there be an objective entity in the system that is able to professionally assess someone who is not responsible for the system, but is professional enough to assess the outcomes that the defense system presents. This is a kind of risk management that has to be used, and these discussions have to be held in all honesty, and it has to be understood what the risks that are being taken are, because when you decide on a defense budget, there are always decisions of that nature. The same thing is true of the health budget. There are things that will not be addressed or not addressed well, and that is part of the discussion, and it's important to understand that too, especially when you do multi-year planning. Because when you do multi-year planning, the system will be exposed to these risks over time. Something that's very important in planning of this kind is to give significant weight to the building of flexible systems that can address various threats. If every threat has only one response that cannot respond to anything else, then it's probably not very efficient. Let me give you an example from the health system. We're all familiar with the internal departments in the hospitals in the winter when they have beds occupied 140, 50%, something that appears intolerable. But if you go around the hospitals on the same day, you'll see departments that have only 50% of their beds occupied. That's something that's the result of unflexibility of the system and lack of efficiency. You know, I'm not a medical expert. I don't know if it's actually possible, But the idea is to build a system that enables you to use those beds at different times of the year. There are places where that is done better. There are places where it's not done at all. And for reasons of field security, I won't give examples that we have in the Army, but there are decisions that are made on a very expensive scale that reflect this kind of flexibility. Another thing that is very important, we talked about security. Security is also a normal consumer product, as it were. Given that somebody has to decide what security is, one of the arguments that always comes up is that the government, the civilian system, comes and says to the army, we want you to deal with this problem, because as we see it, it's a security problem. For example, a fence on the border in with Egypt. And then the security system says, I'll decide what's a defense problem or security problem. I don't care how many illegal immigrants come through the border. I have other issues to deal with. And if you want me to build you a fence, then pay for it. And then the question comes up, and it's very important, who decides what security is and what defense is? The government decides how much it's willing to spend on defense. It also had to define what defense is and what security is, and the needs can change from one period to the next. And that is one of the decisions that need to be made, how exactly that is done, who's responsible for deciding how much freedom you give to the defense system to decide on strategic goals, and how much you leave in the hands of civilians. And the last thing is the matter of streamlining, of greater efficiency. The Brender guidelines gave a considerable weight to the issue of efficiency, and when you try to measure it, it's very difficult. One of the examples that I asked about, because I heard the stories that there was a base where the lights were turned off from 7 o'clock in the evening because there were very few people, and it wasn't and it was wasteful to leave the electricity on. And I asked where the plus, and they said, yes, there's another base nearby. And they said, yes, but we have to put extra guards on duty because it's dark there. So there are interactions between the military and civilian systems, and these sometimes you can save in the army by placing part of the burden on the civilian system. So the question of streamlining is an important one. I admit that I met with many people who are involved in this, and my conclusion was that it's a waste of time. The system can streamline, but ultimately the amounts that will be saved are very little. The real streamlining is in the operational decisions. Do you buy this plane or that plane, or do you what you do in maintenance or maintenance program? That's where the billions are. The little decisions are important, and it's important that a system watch out for the pennies too, but that's not where the big money is. And that's why on this matter, once again, you need the same system that knows how to criticize the defense system and these operational decisions, because there was a complaint, why only for the defense system? And in this discussion, there are always all kinds of apologies and excuses, and I would like to say very bluntly that you don't need it only for the defense system. I think it's very important to adopt multi-year budgets for non-defense systems too, for civilian systems. And many of the things we look at that disturb us are the lack of consistency in policy and the lack of multi-year planning. I can tell you, I drove this morning for about a half an hour, and I heard the news on the radio. And during that time, there was the following. The books law that was decided on for a tri-appeal has been canceled. The summer camps for fourth graders that the Minister of Education promised, the previous minister promised for this summer, has been canceled because the minister used the money for something else but forgot to tell us. And the matriculation tests program has changed, and students who were 16 a year and a half ago suddenly have to do something completely different in a completely different order. And the nursing insurance that people have in the HMO suddenly discovered that certain things are no longer covered. I'm not saying if any of these reforms are good, bad, useless, or helpful, but there's a problem with a system that is constantly changing its decisions. This also makes it more expensive because the citizen who is afraid that his nursing insurance won't cover everything will spend more money, and the parents that need the summer camp and suddenly discover that there is no summer camp for their children suddenly realize they have to find another arrangement. And this is all within the space of a 30-minute drive. That's what I heard. And we all know it's far broader than that. And here we need to build the mechanism so that the same thing that worked with the defense budget, and we saw that it did work in terms of the total spending on defense, should also work in civilian areas. And you need a multi-year plan that will enable the system to provide stability, because it's not enough. Even if you have the budget, you can still change things, but that's the first thing that's needed. And in this context, I'd like to say that one of the things that give room for that stability is the numerator that was recently adopted, because the government wrote checks without relating to the rules that it itself decided on, and they had to decide that day what to do. So they raised the deficit, they changed this, and they moved that, and they removed a lot of we can all remember examples of, and here the new is one of the mechanisms that enables the government to carry on the plans that it has planned on. I recently heard the director of the PMO saying very proudly, we have a lot of government decisions, and the ones that we have made, we are actually implementing, because there is a budget, there is a system, and there is a ceiling. It's a short period, but this is something in someone who's in the policy making, that the important thing is not to make decisions, but to actually carry them out. And that will be very helpful. And one of the complaints that were heard about the 2-year budget, well, one of the things said that they need a 2-year budget because there's a lot of work for the officials who have to deal with the budget on a yearly basis, and there's so many discussions. When we're talking about multi-year plans, and that's one of the reasons that we feel that it's such a problem, the number of decisions you make every year, the number of items you have to decide on goes down, and so you can decide on the norm that most countries in the world have decided on, and this is one of the things that can enable that streamlining. So I think that's why the discussion or the argument why the defense budget gets the multi-year, I think we should learn from the multi-year of the defense budget and move it over to the civilian area. Thank you.